Hello, welcome to Chapter 18. We'll be discussing the Progressive Era, so ending up where we left off last time at the year 1900, the turn of the 20th century, and ending in 1916. So another event that sort of epitomizes the time frame that we're talking about for this week is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. In March of 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City went up in flames. It was on the top 3 floors of a 10-story building, and there were 500 Jewish and Italian young women who worked there, and children, in horrible conditions, including that the doors were locked to be sure they weren't using the bathroom instead of working, and so the company said that they were trying to avoid theft as well. 146 died inside or had jumped out of the building, and jumping from that high, they died because there was no exit for them because they were locked in. This was horrifying to many, many people. The public saw this as an abuse of the workers themselves, and they saw this as something that needed to change. They needed the companies to change and provide safe working conditions for those who were working for them. And it not only inspired the public who didn't work there, but it also inspired unions to go on strike until they had safe working conditions. Progressivism was the name of this era, and it's the name of this entire this idea that is defined as a broad, loosely defined political movement of individuals and groups who hope to bring about significant change in American social and political life. What that essentially means is they weren't necessarily one unified cause. It was many different causes that they were looking to work for, and for that it made it less of a united movement and more of this time frame in which many of these movements came to be, and a political party which focused on some of the main underpinnings that could be found in many of these causes. So some of the main concerns of the time were labor reform, like we saw with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, needing to have safe working conditions, and needing to be fair to employees. We also saw many instances of women's reform coming up, so looking for the right to vote, and looking for the ability to go to work and obtain an education. Part of the way that this was approached was through social science, and those who worked within these parameters to try to apply a scientific method to helping people straighten out their lives. There were a number of academics who registered their complaints against big business at this point. They were suggesting that big business was mostly detrimental to society and that things needed to change drastically in favor of the workers themselves. What they were looking for overall, if you could put it all under a larger umbrella, was basic human rights, and the basic comforts that we've all come to expect while one was at work. This time period is the last time that both farms and cities expanded together. So rural and urban populations both expanded during this time. And the Homestead Act had about 1 million claims from 1900 to 1910, which meant that people were moving out of the cities. So those million claims represented people moving out of the cities and onto parcels of land that were granted to them by the government. Irrigation techniques that had been created in recent years allowed for more and more land to be used for farming and required less labor than they had before. So more and more people gained access to subsistence farming, essentially. By 1910, there were 21 cities with a population over 100,000 people, with New York City alone at 4.7 million people, and Manhattan specifically at 2 million people. Many people wanted to leave these cities because they were becoming overcrowded. They had been overcrowded, and they were becoming increasingly so. And the poor within the cities were generally sentenced to live within tenement buildings, which were often unsafe and unsanitary. They were sometimes dangerous places to live without the regular things that we think of today, like fire escapes and that sort of safety initiative. Muckrakers were a huge part of how the plight of all of these people came to be known to the larger public. So muckraking is the practice of using journalism to expose the negative aspects of U.S. society. You can see the top part, the top comic here, and you can see in the bones and in the pile, the steaming pile, it says meat scandal. That's in reference to what The Jungle covered. The Jungle was published in 1906 by Upton Sinclair and depicted the unsanitary slaughterhouses and meatpacking industry, as well as the detriment to the workers within those places. In direct response to this publication, the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed and the Meat Inspection Act in the same year as this book was published. There was wide outcry about the conditions within the factories, not only for the safety of the food, but also for the safety of the people. Part of what they were attempting to uncover was the terrible working conditions. There were about 2 million children under 15 working without any regulation, and most of those working, within these industries were quite poor and had very little access to legal remedies and very little access to the higher echelons of the labor unions, and couldn't necessarily get the help that they needed to create a better situation for themselves. Many of the people who worked within these industries were immigrants from Europe. And from 1900 to 1914, with World War I starting in 1914, 13 million immigrants came to the United States, many of them from Italy, Russia, and Austro-Hungary. The Chinese were still not allowed to immigrate at this point, so they were negligible in numbers at this point because it would have been illegal, and it was much more difficult at that point to immigrate outside of the regular channels. There was worldwide movement with the increase in manufacturing, so people were moving from farms into cities, and they were moving to different countries that had better manufacturing prospects because it meant that there were more jobs available. Ellis Island is famous for being the gateway in the east to the United States. In 1892, it was a main processing center for immigrants coming from the east. Angel Island is the counterpart to Ellis Island, and it's off the coast of San Francisco, and it served the same purpose for the West. It was mostly Asian immigrants would come through there, but many people can trace their families back to having come through these portals into the United States. Another way that people came was from Mexico. From 1900 to 1930, 1 out of every 10 Mexicans moved to the United States. It was about 1 million people total. And by 1910, 1 out of 7 Americans had been born outside of the U.S. So 6 out of 7 were born within the United States, but many of them were Their parents had come from elsewhere, but 1 out of 7 Americans was born outside of the United States and had made it into the country. Part of this expanding population and these expanding urban areas meant that there was this new market for mass consumption, and there was a middle class that was sort of forming that had some disposable income and was ready to spend it on leisure activities and on things for their homes and for clothing, that sort of thing, that they hadn't really been doing in large numbers before. You see the rise to accommodate this of department stores, mail order catalogs, amusement parks, dance halls, theaters, Nickelodeons, which showed films for 5 cents. Young women had access to this lifestyle finally because they were starting to find more reliable work, and that meant that they had some extra income and they were able to spend it on dates if they wanted to, or going out with their female friends, or buying the newest fashions. Of course, this is only the middle class white women typically. There were some middle class African American women, but they often had a harder time affording many of the things that became popular during this time frame. Eventually, you see goods being linked with the idea of liberty, the access to goods. And the living wage became the American standard of living. You needed a living wage in order to participate in this new consumer culture. So if you were outside of this consumer culture, many people felt that they were second-class citizens and that they didn't have the same access that others did to the cultural elements of living within the United States. One of the major improvements on manufacturing at this point is Ford. Henry Ford was the first to make cars available to regular people who had a middle income rather than those solely at the top. In 1905, he established the Ford Motor Company, and in 1908 created the Model T, which you see in the upper left photo. By 1913, the assembly line began in Highland Park, Michigan for car production. And the following year, Ford introduced the famous $5 day. $5 was actually double the wages of similar jobs and was instituted by Henry Ford so that the workers who were making the products could actually buy the products they were making. This was a combination of mass production and mass consumption because it opened up a new market by allowing those people who made the vehicles to also buy them. They would make the money from the Ford Company and then give money back to the Ford Company. So they were making the money in 2 different ways, but they were also being paid double what someone in their position was being paid elsewhere. This led to a concern over industrial freedom. So Frederick Taylor had this system that he called scientific management. And this is the idea that workers should obey the orders of the employer and everything should be dealt with as efficiently as possible. I decided to include a picture of a cat for you this time who was doing scientific calculations so that you could take a little break and think that the cat is very cute, because I do too. But back to Frederick Taylor and his scientific management. Unions were relatively opposed to this movement because they wanted to maintain a certain level of autonomy and ownership over their work, and this concept of scientific management basically stripped them of that experience. It just gave them steps to follow to create something, and the pride of creating the thing was taken away from many people at this point. Industrial freedom and industrial democracy were concerns of many workers, and what it is they essentially wanted a say. They wanted a say in how they created it, and they wanted a say in the facilities in which they were doing so. People also often used the term industrial slavery. We should be careful when using the term slavery with anything, because it is indeed its own thing. It's defined as being forced to work against your will for no pay. People were being paid, even if it was low-paid wage work. This is not to say that their situations weren't dire, and it's not to say that their situations weren't unfair. It's just to say that it is not actual slavery. Many people have used this in their arguments and throughout their protests over the years, because they know it evokes a certain sense of emotional intimacy with those who are hearing it. It garners sympathy and convinces one to be on the side of those who are oppressed. However, they could not use the term slavery and still garner sympathy and still explain their situation as dire. So just be careful when you refer to things as slavery if they aren't indeed slavery. Slavery still exists today in many places around the world. So it's not a bygone institution. Socialism is a concept that came up at this time with the hopes that there could be some sort of leveling out of society. So in 1901, the U.S. saw the Socialist Party movement with a focus on free education, which would be paid for through taxes, improved conditions of laborers, public ownership of the railroads and factories, as well as many other points. These are some of the major points for them. And public ownership of the railroads and factories meant that there would be government oversight, and the government oversight would be chosen by the people themselves. In 1912, there were around 150,000 dues-paying members, and there were also elected officials within the Socialist Party on the local level and throughout the nation. Eugene Debs is one of the major figureheads as a railroad union leader. We talked about him in the last lecture, being jailed for the Pullman strike in 1894. He actually went on to garner 6% of the presidential votes in 1912, just under 1 million votes. So this was not an insignificant movement. There were many people who were interested in this party platform, and you can see that it wasn't always just Democrat versus Republican. There were other parties that attempted to break in and make a stand. And we're seeing some of the remnants of that today, with people actually, once again, declaring themselves as democratic socialists, meaning they were for many of the things that we've talked about and will continue to talk about, and that they also are for electing those officials who would oversee these things. The American Federation of Labor was made up largely of skilled workers and craft laborers who were white and born in the United States. This was part of the labor movement. It was a large part of the labor movement, in fact. And they were oftentimes supporters of the socialist movement. The Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, was made up of immigrants, women, African Americans, and the Chinese, and they were more revolutionary and acknowledged that there needed to be an overhaul of the entire system. So you could find some anarchists, you could find some communists, and you could find many socialists who wanted to do away with the capitalist way of doing things because they saw that it didn't work for most people. And strikes were particularly popular and had the backing of the concept of collective bargaining, which meant this was solidarity among laborers, and they would bring their grievances together to have more power as a group. In Lawrence, Massachusetts, there were around 32,000 employees in the mills, and many went on strike when the 54-hour work week maximum was put into place because workers were losing out on wages that they needed. Their children were sent to New York City for a public sympathy stunt, and the employees actually ended up winning their case in this instance. As we've been over before, this largely wasn't the case to go up against big business and win out, but in some cases they did. And it oftentimes had to do with public sentiment and how the business wanted to look in front of the rest of the nation. And if they reacted poorly to what the business was doing, they wanted to maintain customer base and would do what they thought their customer base would want them to do. I'm sure that sounds familiar. Another concern of the time was civil liberties. Mother Jones, pictured here for you, also Mary Jones, also known as Mary Jones, suggested that unions had the Constitution behind them and were working within the law, and that big business and the opposition had bayonets. Basically, they had force to make people do what they wanted them to do, while the unions were working through the Constitution. Free speech was under scrutiny at this point because unions had a limited capacity to strike in public places or to gather in public places eventually. Many localities made rules against people gathering in public and discussing political issues. If they weren't allowed to do this, they weren't able to create a plan around what they wanted to strike for and around what they wanted to do, around what they wanted to bring to the government's attention, etc. So many of them were jailed for continuing to meet within these groups so that they could organize their thoughts and they could organize their actions. In response to being jailed for these gatherings, many people went out on purpose attempting to get arrested so that they could fill up the jails and basically be a nuisance to the town and to the officials of the town wherever they were living. Free speech eventually won out in these cases, and people were able to meet and discuss what they wanted. And partially this is because free speech was seen as so central to the idea of liberty for so long in the United States that it seemed blasphemous to go against it to a large portion of the population. And this is still something that we are attempting to balance out even today. So, for instance, neo-Nazis have the right to have a peaceful protest. They have the same rights that a group for civil rights would have that would be standing out on any given main street, so long as they have a permit and they're peacefully protesting. This creates a moral quandary for a lot of people, but generally speaking, the right to free speech is upheld regardless of who it needs to be upheld for. The new feminism was coming into vogue at this point as well. This was seen as an attack on the traditional rules of sexual behavior, as well as an attack on gender roles in the workplace. So feminism had meant, and still continues to mean, the equality of women to men. And the essential notion for this new feminism is that women should enjoy the same rights as men, both as humans and sexually. And with that, talk of sexuality started to enter the public sphere in a way that it hadn't before. Women going to work also meant that there was more interest in birth control in order to be able to control family size and to allow women the chance to seek out a career if they wanted to. Emma Goldman is a famous anarchist, originally from Lithuania, and eventually married to Max Goldman, another famous anarchist and intellectual. And she gave lectures on homosexuality acceptance and also on the necessity of birth control. So she believed in controlling the size of the family and giving women the right to decide for themselves if they wanted children or not. Margaret Sanger is probably the most famous person you've heard of in this realm, and she took up the cause of birth control as her central life's work. She promoted sex education and talked quite openly about venereal disease, which was considered lewd at the time. And in 1916, she opened a clinic in Brooklyn that served poor women. She was actually jailed for having run it and for having promoted lewd ideologies by suggesting that women could have protected sex, which meant that they were having sex for fun. There were many options at the time, but the effectiveness of early methods didn't really significantly improve until the mid-20th century. The pill seems to have been the most effective option that has come to market thus far, but it was quite a ways off at this point. Margaret Sanger also published a paper that you'll see on the left called The Woman Rebel. The progressive idea wasn't limited entirely to middle-class white people, even though that was a large portion of who was participating because they had the most time. But there were also Native American progressives. The Society of American Indians was founded in 1911, and it was a pan-Indian rights group that was independent of white control. They didn't have white leaders leading the group. They didn't have white government representatives interfering with what they were doing. They were interested in determining the fate of Native American people within the United States. And in 1916, Carlos Montezuma, you see on the right here, the single man in the picture, published Wasaja, which means the signaling. This was a newsletter that suggested that there should be the abolition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was the government-controlled organization that dealt with Native American issues. So this was a U.S. government bureau instead of Native Americans deciding for themselves. And they believed that the rights should belong to the Native American people themselves rather than to the United States government. As we discussed previously, Native American citizenship did not fully take effect until 1924 on a federal basis, but there were pockets of Native Americans who were instated as citizens prior to 1924. Behind all of this is this idea of effective freedom. As described by John Dewey, it meant the power to do specific things. Essentially, this means it's not a nebulous, idealized freedom, but one that you could take action on specific things on a daily basis. So this is something that affects your day-to-day life rather than just the idea of freedom in the pursuit of happiness, something more vague. This was an international movement with Europe and the United States influencing one another relatively effectively, and European countries began to establish policies like old age pensions and a minimum wage and unemployment insurance and workplace safety. These are all things we're familiar with, but didn't come for another couple decades at this point. We were lagging behind the Europeans in this case. Social legislation was a main interest that people had, and they wanted an activist, socially conscious government that would act on their behalf and not necessarily just act on the amount of money that they received from big businesses. smaller local governments enacted the most number of reforms and the most effective reforms that changed people's day-to-day lives because it was easier to do this on a smaller scale. You found less opposition regionally, and you found that you could more immediately change somebody's situation than you could at the federal level. Many of the increases that towns and cities decided on went to things like public schools, parks, and public space. They were hoping to expand education and to expand the possibility of leisure time. The West at this point was still evolving politically and socially. So many remained or had been populists and were looking to regulate the railroads and other corporations that threatened their democracy. So they were concerned with big business still, and it was obvious to them on a day-to-day basis with the selling of agricultural goods. Oregon was the center for reform in the West, and part of what this meant was that voters could propose measures that would then be voted on by other Oregonians. They had direct primaries that were instated, and they had the right to recall an elected official. Finally, women were able to vote in Oregon. A lot of these piecemeal endowments of suffrage across the nation are sort of like what you would have seen a few years ago with the right for same-sex marriage. That went state to state for a while before it became federal law. You're seeing the same thing also with the legalization of recreational and medical marijuana. You're seeing that move state by state, and the federal laws still haven't caught up for that one yet, but you can assume that they will within the next decade. And California was attempting to separate the railroads and politics. They were trying to take that massive amount of money that was within the railroad system and take that out of politics. They also outlawed child labor and fought for the fair treatment of women in the workplace. The Wisconsin idea was the thought process of Robert Lafayette, and it stated that there should be primaries, there should be a tax on corporate wealth, and there should be state regulation of railroads and utilities. So many people within big business found these things to be terrifying, that they wouldn't necessarily have as much control over the primary system. They would have to pay a tax, and that there would be state regulation of railroad and public utilities that people used. There's this sense of this growing progressive democracy during this time frame. You have the 17th Amendment that is passed in 1913, and this states that U.S. senators are chosen by the people and not by legislatures. You'd seen that go state by state, but this made it a federal law. And the 19th Amendment also had gone state by state before, but this was passed in 1920, which granted women the right to vote. This was the largest single expansion of democracy in American history. It was half the population. And of course, effectively, this only went to white women because African American women would be barred in the same way as African American men were barred from voting all throughout the South and in many places in the North and West as well. There were new literacy tests and registration requirements that were attempting to limit the vote from the poor and from African Americans. And part of this progressive democracy was also that there was a faith in the elite intellectuals rather than all of the people combined. And perhaps what we could learn from history is that the combination of intellectuals who have information plus the feelings of the people who are not necessarily elite intellectuals. Perhaps these things combined would make the most fair ruling rather than either one controlling the other. Jane Addams in the Hull House is sort of an example of this middle ground. Jane Addams was born in 1860 and went on to establish Hull House in 1889. And she's known as a women's rights advocate and as an advocate for the poor and immigrant communities. Hull House was what's called a settlement house that was established in Chicago to help improve the lives of immigrant men, women, and children. What they also focused on was creating playgrounds, kindergartens, health clinics, employment bureaus for women, and they supported women who had suffered abuse as well. Eventually, this movement spread, and there were about 400 settlement houses throughout the country by 1910. And Hull House is probably the most famous, and it's still set up as a museum. If you visit Chicago, you can visit the Hull House, and you can see some of Jane Addams' books and furniture, and some of her FBI records actually set up for you to look through. In 1900, there were only about 80,000 college-educated women in the United States who mostly found jobs in social services, education, and nursing. So while some did have access to college, it's still relatively few, and they were sort of pigeonholed into particular jobs if they did go to college. Florence Kelley is one famous veteran of the Hull House movement and went on to found the National Consumers League, which dealt with working conditions for women and children, as well as purchasing habits. So this movement with Jane Addams and the settlement house movement was extremely helpful in seeing that they could weave together these different progressive movements for women's rights and for immigrants' rights and work together against a common enemy. Women's suffrage was still a major concern until 1920, in which it became legal federally, but still with the limitations that we talked about before. By 1900, the suffrage movement was beginning to be more inclusive. It had been a wealthy white women's movement, but moved more into the middle classes and attempted to bring in those on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale as well. In 1917, the National American Women's Suffrage Association actually had 2 million members nationwide. By 1900, you can see on the map to the left here, half of the states allowed women to vote in local elections, and a few had full women's suffrage. In 1913, women in Illinois could vote for president, which was the first state to allow that east of the Mississippi. So you could see the variance of years that women gained the right to vote. And you can see most of the East Coast did not have suffrage prior to 1920. So it's pretty startling map. And if you think about it, 100 years really isn't that long of a time. Many of us have grandparents or great-grandparents who were alive when women couldn't vote. So it's not so far removed from us within the historical record. And this should serve as a reminder that this is only within the United States. There are many countries throughout the world that still don't allow women to vote, even today, or many countries that have recently acquired the right to vote for women. Part of the women's movement at this point was this to use a modern term, leaning into the reality of what it meant to be a mother. There was this maternalist reform, and women were concerned with maternal abilities of womanhood in addition to the expansion of working opportunities being presented to them. Many fought for aid to young mothers who could not support themselves on the wages that were paid to women for their work. Many times women were paid what was called pin money, assuming that they didn't need the financial income and that they were relying on a man for their basic needs. They were paid a much lower wage in the thought that they were just going to spend it on frivolous things. The maternalist reformers wanted to encourage motherhood and at the same time secure women's economic independence. Muller v. Oregon in 1908 limited the maximum hours for women based on childbearing opportunities and supposed lack of strength. And by 1917, 30 states had these laws that limited women's work. Theodore Roosevelt was the first of the progressive presidents, which would include Taft and Wilson as well. In 1901, President McKinley was killed after a short time in office, and Teddy Roosevelt became president, and he was the youngest to this day at 42 years old, followed by JFK, Clinton, Ulysses S. Grant, and Obama as the following in order of age. There is at least one candidate running in 2020 who would be younger, and that's Pete Buttigieg, and he's 37 right now. So it's possible that we add on an even younger president. But as of right now, Theodore Roosevelt is the youngest president ever to take office, moving up from vice president up to the presidency. He established what was called the Square Deal, which put big businesses into good and bad categories. Some of the businesses that we're talking about that he put into the good categories are those ones that are often debated as either robber barons or titans of industry. So U.S. Steel was one of them, for example, and he put that into a good category. And partially this was because of the philanthropic work that was done from the top echelons of these companies, but there may have also been financial involvement, which would not, I'm sure, shock anybody. He did have J.P. Morgan's Northern Security Company prosecuted under antitrust laws in order to break up a monopoly over travel on the railroad from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Ocean. So he did, in fact, use some of the laws against some of the big businesses, but was also cozier with some of the big businesses than some people wanted him to be. The Interstate Commerce Commission was given the rights under Theodore Roosevelt to set rates and to examine the railroad business to make sure that it was running fairly. Roosevelt was also interested in regulation from the government on big business, period. He thought that government oversight would ensure more fairness within these companies. John Muir and the conservation movement were essential to this time period and also essential to the understanding of Theodore Roosevelt about how to continue within this conservation movement. In 1872, Yellowstone Park was the first national park, and it was made so both to protect it and to promote tourism in the area with the railway running nearby. In the 1890s, John Muir established the Sierra Club, which focused on preservation of land. So this was hoping to be a continuation of this setting aside land to enjoy and consequently also to promote tourism to these spaces. For Muir, it was a religious experience to be in the woods. He had been influenced by the Transcendentalist movement, but took it a step further and combined his religious upbringing with his feelings that he obtained when he was out in the woods. He's known as one of the fathers of the environmental movement, and he actually had quite an interesting life. There are many biographies out there. If you're interested at all in this topic, I definitely suggest reading up on him, Rachel Carson, and Aldo Leopold. I think many people would enjoy all of those characters of this movement. And Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to take the issue of land preservation to the federal level. And he did visit with John Muir several times and go to different parks with him. And he instituted Gifford Pinchot as the first head of the U.S. Forest Service. So the idea was to preserve more space and to ensure that the country would remain beautiful and that there would be places for people to experience nature and to get away from their urban lifestyles. This was the beginning of the rise of this sort of movement for vacation, if you will. So people were looking at taking time off work, and they were looking at shorter hours at work, and they were wanting to commune with nature as they'd been more and more removed from it, the less agrarian the lifestyle they were living. The election of 1912 was actually a four-way race. You'll see many of the depictions of this race, if you Google image this, will show three different categories and discount the socialist presence of this election. There's a long history that we're going to go over about this fear of socialism and its conflation with communism, actually. And we'll talk a lot more about that this semester, but it continues to have an influence on the way things are presented. And the four running were William Howard Taft as a Republican, Theodore Roosevelt as the Progressive Party, Woodrow Wilson in the Democratic Party, and Eugene Debs in the Socialist Party. There were four different party affiliations that were running. And that may sound weird to many people because we've, for a long time, had just two major parties that were running. We have seen the Green Party and we have seen the Tea Party, but these have more or less appeared as offshoots of the major groups. But there have, in fact, been completely separate parties that were running, and not that long ago. So it is possible to create another one going forward if people wanted to. The main point of contention for voters at this point was the connection between big business and economic freedom. Woodrow Wilson ended up winning this election with 42% of the popular vote. But he did win 82% of the Electoral College. Again, you can reference the video on the Electoral College on the assignments page for this week if you're unclear on how it works. He was the first to have regular press conferences and also the first to directly address Congress instead of sending written material to them. And he also instituted the Underwood Tariff, which reduced duties on foreign goods and taxed 5% higher on the wealthy. The Clayton Act in 1914 stated that unions were exempt from antitrust laws, and it protected the right to strike. And in 1916, the Keating-Owens Act was passed, and this outlawed child labor for interstate goods, so goods that traveled from one state to another. So, for example, you could not use child labor in the mines when the goods from there were going to be sent to the East Coast. And the Adamson Act created an 8-hour workday on the railroads. We talked about this before, but there was this call for an 8-hour workday, which was 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, and 8 hours for what you will. And the what you will part was that consumer culture that we were talking about and participating in leisure activities. Wilson also expanded the government with the Federal Reserve System, which is 12 regional banks with a central board that issues currency, aids failing banks, and controls interest rates. This is something that we still work within. Also, the Federal Trade Commission, which is something that we still work within, was established to investigate and prohibit unfair business practices. So the essential goal of the progressive movement in the progressive era was to bridge this gap between the ultra-wealthy and the regular people, and to try to bring fairness to the most number of people. Many of these experiences were often misguided and were racially segregated, and this has been a criticism of this time period, and we could learn lessons from that if we want to change things, we should have larger umbrellas that can hold more people under them in order to create greater change. So next week, we will talk about World War I, and you will end up writing a paper about a film covering World War I as well. So we will move forward from this point, and keep learning how things continue to build on one another and how they affect what we've been